Good evening. I am Carol Allman Morton, the Executive Director of the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute at Berkshire Community College. We are a community of people 55 years old and better, committed to learning and growth. Welcome to tonight's lecture, Ukraine, Russia, and the West, the Outlook for 2023 with James Brooke. We are so grateful, Jim, for you to be here with us tonight, and thank you so much to John Dixon for moderating. Before we begin, I have just a few announcements. If you haven't checked out the calendar of upcoming OLLI events, I encourage you to do so, and I'm going to put the link in the chat. Also, our spring semester of courses opened today, and you can check out the course listings and register on our website, and here's the link to that. And then finally, this lecture will be recorded and posted to the OLLI YouTube page, we expect by Friday, barring ice storms up here in the Northeast. So the link to our OLLI YouTube page is there. And now I'm going to hand things over to John Dixon, OLLI at BCC member and volunteer, and author of the Berkshire County's Industrial Heritage and History Shock, where history collides with foreign relations. Thank you so much, John.
Thank you, Carol, and nice to see everybody here tonight. Even though the subject is not one that is all good news, it's been a very difficult year. Very pleased, though, that guiding us through this past year has been Jim Brooke, a Lenox and Berkshire County native who has been able to and has been more than willing to share his expertise and his insights with us 4 times. This is the 4th time, and it's nice to see that, Jim, that people want and respect you and keep coming back for your updates. Jim grew up in Lenox. He graduated from Yale. He went right into the world of journalism, wanting to be a foreign correspondent. He speaks multiple foreign languages. As a foreign correspondent with the New York Times, he served in Brazil, Canada, West Africa, Tokyo, and Seoul. He then did some business consulting in Russia and the former Soviet Union before signing on as correspondent for the Voice of America for Russia. And after 8 years in Russia, he moved to Ukraine. And 6 years in Kyiv, he founded and edited internet-based newsletters on Ukraine's business and investment opportunities. He recently relocated back home to Berkshire County, but he continues to serve as editor of Ukraine Financial News. You can see 14 years in this part of the world makes him an ideal person to walk us through the complexities of this. So, Jim, thank you once again for agreeing to share your time with us and talk to everybody tonight. Look forward to hearing from you.
Great, John. Thank you very much. And thank you, Carol, for hosting me on the OLLI network. And I see we have 1,000 signups for Zoom. So there's obviously a lot of interest in where we are with the Ukraine-Russia war. It's been a very busy week. As you know, we started off with President Biden making a really unprecedented trip to wartime Kyiv. Probably the first time a U.S. president had visited a country at war where there were no U.S. troops. So it took a fair amount of guts to take that 10-hour train ride in. And for better or worse, apparently the White House told the Russians that he was coming in, so there would not be an accident. That was followed yesterday by President Putin giving a stemwinder speech, framing the war as saying that they're under attack by NATO. It was Russia against NATO, and obviously ignoring that Russia attacked Ukraine, and obviously not touching on the high casualties, which I'll get into later tonight. And now tomorrow, the premier of China, Xi, will give what's being billed as a peace speech. China is playing an interesting role. I think they've woken up to the fact that Putin could lose, and even maybe there could be some sort of regime change. And I think they're very worried about all this. They have to tread very carefully. They were really spooked when the EU and the US slapped these major trade sanctions on Russia. As you know, China is the world's largest trading country. They're very dependent on exports and imports. So they have to tread carefully. So they're going to try to position themselves as a peace broker, and they do have a lot of clout with Russia, but they don't want to see Putin fail. It sends a terrible signal about their plans to invade Taiwan, and they have a good deal in the Russian Far East. They're basically getting what they want, which is oil, gas, water, wood, diamonds, coal, without having to run the place. And in the past, there've been wars between Russia and China. Anyhow, let's move on to the 1 year later focus. As some of you may have seen, I did talk to you about 10 days before the war, and I was fairly pessimistic at that point. So years gone by, and what have we learned? We learned basically that what we've seen is the Russian army has been cut in half. It's lost about half of its operable main battle tanks, 2,000 tanks. It's lost 3,500 APCs, armored personnel carriers. Excuse me, that's wrong. It's 6,500 APCs. These things don't grow on trees. And so Russia really is, I hate to overstate it, but probably no longer a threat to Eastern Europe. The fear was they would then, after Ukraine, they move on Poland, they move on the Baltics. I don't think they have that operative capacity anymore, thanks to the Ukrainian fighting spirit and to the NATO, US, EU aid, which has been enormous. The British Defense Secretary Ben Wallace said a couple of days ago that he estimated 97% of the Russian military is involved in this war. So they're really running out of spares, to put it politely. We've discovered that really Russia does not have any allies to speak of. The Iranians sold them these Shaded drones, which are described as noisy lawnmowers going along at 100 miles an hour. After a week or two, the Ukrainians figured out how to shoot them down. The North Koreans are selling them weaponry, which probably dates back to the 1950s of the Korean War. And for China, we've seen a lot of votes in the UN, but really not much. Once again, they're treading that fine line, where they don't want to provoke trade sanctions from Europe. The U.S. Secretary of State met with his Chinese counterpart in Munich last month and said, we're picking up that China wants to send lethal weapons to Ukraine. And Blinken said, don't do that. I think the Chinese sort of leaked that because they want to strengthen their hand as in the negotiating table. It wouldn't really make them an honest broker, but if they could dangle that threat of sending military aid to Russia, that ideally would make us sit up and take notice tomorrow with their peace overtures. We've also learned that the vaunted Soviet Russian Air Force and the vaunted Soviet Russian Navy are really not that impressive. The Air Force has lost about 200 fixed wing airplanes and consequently does not enter Ukrainian airspace. It doesn't do that not because it doesn't want to, but because the Ukrainians have been very successful in playing a shell game with their anti-aircraft and shooting these planes down. And so they'll fly up over Belarus and shoot missiles into Kyiv and Ukraine. And in fact, if you watch that video of President Biden on Monday, walking with President Zelensky to that famous Hall of Honor, which I've seen dozens of times, you'll hear an air raid siren in the background. Apparently, the Russians had sent up a MiG and were from Belarus airfields, and the fear was that it would once again shoot into Ukraine. So the Air Force is basically grounded, or not entering, more accurately, not entering Ukrainian airspace. The Navy suffered a major defeat with the sinking of their flagship, the Moskva. This was kind of the showcase ship that Putin personally had visited 3 or 4 times. It was outfitted with all these incredible anti-aircraft, anti-missile gear. Ukrainians using American real-time intelligence sent their own Turkish-made drones to the south of the ship. The ship moved all its anti-aircraft defenses to the south, and then the Ukrainians hit them in the back of the head with 2 anti-ship missiles fired from Odessa. Ukraine, by the way, in the bad old days of the Soviet Union, designed and built the ICBMs that are aimed at New York. Ukraine has very effective and very sophisticated rocketry skills. So their long distance rockets are quite formidable. I lived in Moscow for 8 years, have Bloomberg bureau chief, then Voice America bureau chief, and I covered the modernization of the Russian army, which we thought was real. What we really have seen in the last year is the Russians are defaulting to Stalin's World War II playbook. They flatten cities with artillery. Mariupol, which I visited a couple of years ago, was a thriving city of 500,000 people. It's now been basically flattened. Another Stalinist tactic, they take prisoners, convicts, and push them up into the front line. This mercenary group, PMC, recruited 50,000 prisoners from Siberian prisons, offering them 6 months at the front and then an amnesty. Well, most of them aren't going to get there. 20,000, 30,000 already been killed. They're pushed out in front. They draw Ukrainian fire, and then the professionals try to take out the Ukrainians. As I said, we feel that 20, 30,000 dead. Just last week, 3,000 of these soldiers were killed in a town called Vuhledar in 3 days. That's 1,000 soldiers killed every day. It's really stunning. And then we've seen the Stalinist tactic of dealing with civilians, which frankly, we're relearning the lessons that our parents and grandparents knew from the 40s and 50s of how Soviet soldiers and occupation forces conducted themselves. Where the Russians take over, they set up filtration camps. They take most of the men off to the side and they're never heard from again. They're probably shot behind the barn. The women and children are sent deep into Russia, often to the Russian Far East, which is further east than Siberia, make it very difficult for them ever to get back to Ukraine, at least short term. And there are various numbers of how many women and children have basically been kidnapped. And this, of course, is a crime against humanity. And then the occupation troops basically have a green light, a license to rob, rape, murder, and steal. And there's a little meme going around in Ukraine that shows a Mi-8 Hind helicopter, and of each of the landing skids is dangling a washing machine or something of value that's been stolen. So they've been stealing a lot. We know about the rapes. What we've learned through modern forensics, modern research by Germans, that from May 45 to probably the end of 46, 2 million German women were raped by Soviet soldiers. I'll put that in the active tense. Soviet soldiers raped 2 million German women in 18 months. That is unfortunately what we saw in Bucha and other occupied areas, where the soldiers felt that one of the spoils of war is rape, rob, and steal. So the image of the new modern Russian soldier has been, let's say, tarnished. And then the tough guy image of Russian men. And once again, I lived in Moscow for 8 years, and everyone's familiar with the stereotype of the loudmouth, heavy drinking, aggressive Russian. I think they're really tough on video games, but when Putin went on the air in September announcing a national, what they call mobilization, a national draft, the joke is that before he stopped speaking, every seat out of Moscow and every plane was booked solid to Istanbul. That basically the people took French leave and decamped, the men. The tally is about 600,000 men, Russian men, left the country for Kazakhstan, Georgia, the Baltics, wherever they could go, even Germany. 600,000 left. Now, to put that in context, in our context, during the Vietnam decade, 1965 to 1975, 60,000 Americans fled up to Canada to avoid the draft. So Putin, in 10 weeks, spooked 10 times the number of Americans who left in one decade. 600,000 men left. Now, there's also been a huge evasion of women. There's estimated to be about 1 million Russians, men and women, aged 20 to 40, that have left since February 24. That's a huge brain drain. Last week, coincidentally, I was in Israel for a week-long vacation, and I started talking to this Russian couple in the Tel Aviv subway, and nice young couple, obviously college educated with 2 little kids. And they just said, we've done Aliyah, we've joined the 20,000 Jews that have left, and then they just left 2 months ago. So there's a huge loss of human capital that Russia suffered with this invasion. There's an amazing story of 2 men who actually piloted a motorboat across the Bering Strait in late September, which is when you definitely do not want to be out on that water. And they left from Chukotka, a little village. And the man told reporters, they got to Alaska, and he said, I'm 51 years old, and the draft guys were banging on the door. So a 51-year-old was feared being drafted. So they're really getting any man who can breathe in and out and throwing him into a uniform and sending him to the front line. And one reason they're doing this is that over the last year, resistance people inside Russia have firebombed with Molotov cocktails about 30 draft offices. So what they've done is, in recent weeks and months, is sort of an undeclared draft where they go to employers, they go to work sites, construction sites, and just grab men. And a little thing to watch is there are 8 million Central Asian men working in Russia, and they're offering them Russian passports if they sign up. And the 5 presidents of the 5 Central Asian republics have said, do not go for this. But I'm sure that Putin will tap into the immigrant labor force. What else have we seen? Those of us who follow this closely for the last 5-10 years, we always were worrying about the energy card. When would Putin really play the energy card and twist the Europeans' arms behind their backs? Well, he did it. We've seen it. He cut the gas off, essentially. And about 50% of Europe's gas imports came from Russia. Putin turned the gas off. Where are we now? Norway has supplanted Russia as the #1 supplier of pipeline gas to Europe, Norway. The US is the #1 exporter of LNG, liquefied natural gas, to Europe. So we've had a reshuffling of the sources of gas for Europe. Also, there's been a real surge in solar capacity and wind investment. And basically, Europe has taken the hit. They paid a huge price. Their winter gas bills are horrible, but they made the transition. European politicians are so pissed off, you can bet that they will not, in the short term, go back to Russian gas. So Putin, with his invasion, has lost the top customer for Russia's top export. Europe is not buying much Russian gas, probably say at a very low level, about 10%. We've also learned a lot about warfare. When I was there was a sort of low-level trench warfare going on in southeastern Ukraine between the Russian-occupied area and the Ukrainian area. And no one in the US bothered to notice, but if you Google, you will see that there were US military observers and reporting giving lectures at West Point on Russian tactics and Russian equipment and sort of thing. Obviously, we're learning a lot more now. And we are in the process of supplying the Ukrainians with really state-of-the-art, well, let's say A- equipment in terms of long-range rockets and tanks, Abrams tanks. So we're seeing how this stuff performs in the field. And it's basically the world's first big drone war. There was a little one, Nagorno-Karabakh, between Armenia and Azerbaijan a couple of years ago, but drones are big, and we're learning how to defend against drones. As I mentioned, these Iranian Shahed drones that are coming in. It's drone against drone. Those incredible videos you'll see, those black and white videos from the front are obviously picked up by drones. Everyone is having to adjust to drone warfare. The Ukrainians have an advantage, and they have a very strong in STEM, the basically IT capabilities. And on that line, on cyber defenses, we expected a big cyber war. We thought that the Russians would shut down the Ukrainian internet. Thanks to Elon Musk and Starlink, internet stayed up, but also thanks to about 5 years of US and EU, largely US cyber defense training and hands-on helping of the Ukrainians. And they were managed to bulletproof a lot of their websites, their cyber capabilities. And, the Russians were sort of a generation behind. I mean, people in Palo Alto could see where the Russian troops were massing because the guys were all calling their girlfriends and wives on their cell phones, and they'd see all these little dots and they could see where they're moving. And the Ukrainians moved on that and shelled these areas once they crossed the border. So, cyber drones, it's a brave new world that we're watching. The big difference is what I suspected. And frankly, when I was talking a year ago, what has surprised me is the US and EU support for Ukraine. I believed, having lived in Ukraine for 6 years, that the Ukrainian nationalist spirit is very strong. I didn't predict that the Russians would be beaten back so hard and so fast. I feared that it would be a 10-year partisan war, a low rent, terrible bloodshed. Instead, we're having real, Kyiv victory, Kharkiv, the second largest city in Ukraine, victory. Kherson, the only regional capital that the Russians took, victory. Russia has not won a major battle in 6 months. And the difference is it's obviously US, NATO aid, but it's also the Ukrainian motivation. The Putin around October brought in a general who'd been in Syria, and what this guy did in Syria earned him the nickname of General Armageddon. He would flatten cities, and he would just bomb indiscriminately. And in October, they started bombing, targeting largely electricity and heating plants, but also just blowing up apartment buildings. The Ukrainians we're now February 22. Spring is around the corner, and the Ukrainians basically have made it through the winter. And public opinion polls are very solid with backing Zelensky and seeing the war through. Latest poll I saw, 93% said they believe that Ukraine will win the war. So this idea of making them freeze in the dark did not cause the Ukrainian population to back down. And we can go back to our parents and grandparents. Did Hitler's bombing of London during the Blitz, did that break the will of the English, of the British people? Obviously, no. I think the other thing, and Putin has lost on so many fronts, the Western resolve has really been surprising and stunning to me. I think Europe was shocked and to some degree frightened by the fact that Russia could just invade a neighboring country, try to take over its capital and depose the government. And as a result, the Germans kind of turned on a dime, and they've yet to come through with all the aid, but they have broken with 75 years of post-World War II policy of never giving aid to a country at war. And you can look around the map, Switzerland, which has been neutral since 1815, 200 years. In Bern, they're discussing allowing the re-export of military equipment. Sweden and Finland are in the process of joining NATO. For 75 years, Finland has played a very careful game in appeasing Moscow, keeping them happy, giving rise to the term Finlandization, being nice and neutral. Finland, on its own free will, responding to what the population wants, has applied to join NATO and will join NATO this year. Sweden, another country that was neutral since 1815, and I've got to check and see what happened in 1815. I think it was the Council of Vienna. The Swedes have been neutral since 1815. They are joining NATO. They're not joining NATO because NATO is putting a gun to their head. They're joining NATO because they are, frankly, afraid of the Russians. Is this a victory for Putin to have his land border with NATO with the addition of Finland? His land border with NATO will double this year. Is it a victory for Putin to have the Baltic Sea becoming a NATO sea? You will have Poland, all the Baltics, 3 Baltic countries, Poland, Germany, Denmark, Sweden, Finland, all NATO, and Russia will be reduced to its little foothold that Peter the Great put together 300 years ago, named as St. Petersburg, and Kaliningrad, the exclave between Poland and Lithuania. So these are major geopolitical setbacks for Russia, very big. And I can just give you another indicator for those of you who missed it. The Czech Republic had a presidential election last month, and there were 2 candidates offering 2 very different versions. One was a basically Russia sympathetic oligarch who said, let's talk and let's try to sort this out. And the other was the former chief of staff of the Czech army, a man who'd had the number 3 post in NATO. And the oligarch billed this as the contest between the diplomat and the soldier. Well, guess what? The soldier won 60-40. So after 11 months of fighting, the Czech population, which doesn't border on Ukraine, in between is Slovakia, the Czech populace voted for the soldier. So I think there's a real sea change in attitudes in Europe today. And I think, obviously Biden's visit to Kyiv on Monday was a huge signal to Europe that the US essentially is all in. We pay a lot of attention to these fringe characters in the Republican Party, representatives. They're about 5 or 10, and they are quite isolationist. But if you look at Zelensky's speech to the joint session of Congress in December, there were 19 standing ovations. That's 19. 19 times the senators and representatives stood up and applauded. So that's the reality. And at the Munich conference last week, there were 3 big Republican heavyweights, Mitch McConnell from the Senate, the minority leader, and the majority leader from the House, McCarthy, who were basically working the Europeans, saying the US is solidly behind Ukraine. And this is before Biden made his surprise visit to Kyiv, which caught me on the unawares, and I think 99% of everyone else. It was totally on the QT. So where are we going? Where are we now? Putin obviously wanted to make that visit to Kyiv on Monday that Biden did. Putin 1 year after the war, he wanted to be the viceroy in Kyiv. He's got the anniversary on Friday. He is obviously has been desperate for a military victory, something to show. He doesn't have anything to show, really. I mean, they've been fighting pretty hard. There's this undeclared Russian offensive that really started last month, and they've lost tens of thousands of soldiers. And their advances, according to the British Defense Ministry, can be measured in meters and not in kilometers. It's been very bloody. It's an undeclared offensive, and the anniversary is rolling around on Friday, and he has nothing to show for it, really. So he, gave this stem-winding speech yesterday, and blamed it all on NATO, et cetera, et cetera. The reason the Russians are throwing the cannon fodder into the maw is that they are obviously racing to achieve land gains before the hundreds of NATO tanks, gifts from NATO countries, and the thousands of fighting vehicles arrive. Right now in southern Ukraine, the ground is largely frozen. You'll see snow on the ground. That'll melt next month. It'll be mushy and gross and muddy. But by May, it'll be solid enough for tanks to maneuver easily. And so the Russians have been desperately trying to make headway before February 24. Well, February 24 is in 2 days, and it's not happening. And some of the equipment, you really can't say that an Abrams tank, a Leopard 2 tank, a British Challenger tank, those are not defensive weapons. So I think the Western leaders are being a little cagey, but basically the US is sending missiles that can go twice as far, 95 miles. We're joining and leading the effort to send state-of-the-art battle tanks. Tanks are not defensive weapons. They don't just sit there. They move, and they move forward. That's what their purpose is. So we are going to see an offensive probably in May. The Russians are kind of, I don't want to lead the witness, but the two things happening. One is that General Armageddon has been pulled off, and the Russians put back in charge, being joined by the younger generation, and put back in charge Gerasimov, who is the general who designed the whole offensive a year ago, which has been a total failure. Defeat in Kyiv, defeat in Kharkiv, defeat in Kherson. And how does Putin respond? He puts General Gerasimov as the number one executive in charge of the Ukrainian war. I mean, most CEOs don't reward utter failure or shareholders, but there are no real shareholders in Russia. There's this other character, and I use that word deliberately, Prigozhin, who runs this mercenary outfit, and he is the one who recruited 50,000 convicts from jails and pushed them forward. And the last couple of days, he's kind of gone berserk. He has recorded messages that have been very public, accusing the defense ministry of not giving him enough ammunition, shorting him on air transport support, and someone blocking him from recruiting more prisoners. Now, this is a guy who really is one of maybe responsible about 20% of the soldiers in the field. And he's told the defense ministry, he said, you are committing crimes and you are committing, quote, high treason, and you are, quote, spitting on my men. This guy is supposed to be on the same team. They're all supposed to be working together. But one of the leaders is accusing the other leaders of high treason. So, and then there's been this shuffle once again. If you're winning, do you really turn on each other? Do you really change the general at the top? I think draw your own conclusions, but once again, Russia's not won a significant battle in 6 months. So where are we now? The general estimate is that 200,000 Russian soldiers have been killed or wounded in the last year. The Ukrainian tally of Russian soldiers killed yesterday hit 145,000. Now, if you compare that to the Soviet 10-year occupation of Afghanistan, in 10 years, the Soviets lost 14,453 in 10 years. During Putin's 1-year war in Ukraine, he, according to the Ukrainian tallies, he has lost 10 times as many soldiers. Okay. And even if you don't want the Ukrainian numbers, he's lost 5 times as many soldiers. Compared to what we went through in Vietnam, we lost in 20 years, we lost 200,000 dead and wounded. Putin's done that in 1 year. And the US population in the 1970s, it was about 30% bigger than Russia today. So this is a huge, huge death toll. And this is coming out of a country that has a shortage of men aged 18 to 30. It's very dramatic. And Putin 2 weeks ago was in Stalingrad, it's now called Volgograd, and he hailed the fighting spirit of the Russian soldier. And what he didn't mention was 1.1 million Soviet soldiers were killed. That's 1 million Soviet soldiers killed or wounded in Stalingrad. The modern Russian society just cannot support that. It is top heavy with old people. They cherish their young men, and they will eventually wake up to these incredible losses. They may have already lost 10 times what they lost in 10 years in Afghanistan. And I'll just say one thing about Afghanistan. Anyone who's traveled in the former Soviet Union, you will see in any city of a decent size, 50,000 over, you will see a monument to the Afghansi, the Soviet soldiers, whether Ukrainian or Central Asian, who died in Afghanistan. It is a core belief that is not touched by the de-Russification campaigns. They don't touch these monuments. And it was a traumatic event for the Soviet Union, the invasion and occupation of Afghanistan and the retreat. And the last Soviet column left Afghanistan. They drove up into Soviet Uzbekistan it was in 1989. What was happening in the Soviet Union then? The separatist movements had already started, but within 20 months, the Soviet Union collapsed. And that was partly pushed by the debacle of the defeat in Afghanistan. So if, connect the dots, if current trends continue, we've got 3 major defeats. If current trends continue, I think it's very difficult for Putin to hang on, especially if he loses Crimea, which is dear to the hearts of Russians and was a huge political victory for Russia in 2014 and can't be airbrushed away, even though Putin controls all the TV, radio, websites. That cannot be ignored. I'm sure many of you of the generation, you may remember the 1970 book by Andrei Almarek, and it was, Will the Soviet Union Survive Until 1984? He was off by 7 years, and he also won a one-way ticket, a ticket to the Gulag. But the question is a good one. Will the Russian Federation, which is composed of 82 different republics and units, many of them linguistically and ethnically based, will the Russian Federation survive? And you pick the date, 2030, 2024. If Putin, if the center is weak the regional governors may go back to what they did in 1991 of disobeying Moscow. The centrifugal forces of the republics may start flying off. If you go back to 1991, there were three layers of breakdown. There was something called Comecon, which was not just the Soviet Union, the Soviet Union plus Cuba, plus Mongolia, plus Vietnam. That fell apart. That was the economic union. Then the Warsaw Pact fell apart. All the, the Eastern European countries, starting with East Germany, but also Poland, Hungary, whatnot. There's about 10 countries broke off from the Warsaw Pact. Then the Soviet Union collapsed, and that was the final disintegration. And the Soviet Union, all 15 republics went their separate way, leaving Russian Federation controlling most, but the western and southern fringe of the Soviet Union went off in their own direction. And by the way, and I know academics are not maybe that important, but there is now a growing movement in academia to look at Russia as an empire, which of course it is, and to look at it as an amalgamation of many different peoples. And Putin has kind of provoked that. So that's where we are. I will just leave you on one thought, that I really think that the economic chickens are going to come home to roost. Last month, Russia's oil and gas revenues were down by 50% year over year. And that's their bread and butter. That's what pays the budget. That's what pays the salaries. And it's a incredibly resource dependent economy. So those revenues will really give an axe blow to the economy. John, I'm going to wrap it up there and pass the baton over to you.
Good. Well, that's great, Jim, because we have a lot of questions, a lot of comments, and as you have gone through, you've addressed a lot of them. And I just want to pick up on a couple of things. One is the changes you've had over the course of the year. In this last part you were just talking about, that you didn't really think before of the possibility of a Russia collapse in the future. And I don't know, honestly, any other way for Putin to come out of this other than victory or some kind of collapse. What do you, if there's no Russian Federation, if there's no Russia, what this could be worse than
I think kind of the dirty little secret is that US, UK, and EU have decided they want the Russian military to be decisively defeated. They prefer it be done without opening up the Crimea can of worms, but a decisive defeat in Russian terms is not good. They lost the Crimean War in 1854, and that forced the Tsar to liberalize a bit, to free the serfs, to sell Alaska. They lost the 1905 war with Japan, and that was a major sort of racial humiliation, the first time that an Asian power had defeated a so-called European power. And that forced the Tsar to start a Duma, a parliament of some sort. And they lost World War I, basically, and that led to the end of the Tsars. We forget there was the Kerensky period where there was a democracy. So, it's not up to me to figure it out, but there's a kind of an odd. Kirill Budanov is the head of Ukrainian military intelligence, and some website showed a photo of a map he had on his wall, and it showed the Russian Federation divided into 4 sections, and the Far East was marked K for Kitai, China, and the middle had some new name, and then the old Russia of Ivan the Terrible was marked Moscovia, Moscow, and then 4 regions were actually marked Ukraine. And I thought that was kind of kooky. And I emailed my friend Andy Kramer, who's the New York Times bureau chief in Kyiv, and he had just interviewed Budanov. He said, I didn't really notice that. There was so much sort of knickknacks on the wall. But about 2 weeks later, Budanov had a birthday party for himself, and this map had been baked into a cake, and he posed on WhatsApp and all the social media. He had a bayonet and he was carving up his Russia cake. So that's one version. I don't think that anyone wants the Ukrainians to go beyond their internationally recognized borders. But I do think it's going to be, the Crimea thing is a can of worms, because the Russians have wreaked such devastation on Ukraine. There's been such destruction that I don't think the Ukrainians will be sort of nice guys. Say, oh yeah, we'll just go back to the February 24 lines and you apologize or something. That's not going to fly. And on the Russian side, they're going to need someone who can get them out of sanctions and move the economy forward. So,
And so we've had a couple of questions about what's going on in Russia. We see different things, and you've addressed the rift in the military and the Wagner Group and economic sanctions. But we also see today these incredible parades and what information are they getting? I know that you were a VOA bureau chief, and that was a Cold War radio, but now there's probably the reason to have VOA. What kind of information are they getting besides these big parades saying,
John, it's very important. And I was on a talk event with Jamie Fry, who is head of Radio Free Europe, which is a really important source of information. And they're all working to adopt VPNs. Yeah. And I'm just giving a candy to perk myself up. VPNs, which would ideally protect people from, being tracked down by the current KGB, which is called the FSB. I think the problem is people don't really trust them. I think they, you want to say hi?
Hello.
So I think people don't trust the VPNs, and so a lot of people are living in this information bubble. And Putin can have his Nuremberg style rallies. At some point, the information bubble will pop, and they'll realize that, gee, we lost 150,000 men for this pointless war, and we've impoverished ourselves, and we've lost all these Western companies and investment. So, but it's not there yet. And I think the Russians are very afraid. And I did say, I think one of our earlier talks that Putin was basically turning Russia into North Korea. I mean, the Russia today is not the Russia I lived in. I mean, all the foreign companies have pulled out. As a Bloomberg bureau chief, that's closed. VOA was kicked out. Go down the line, whether it's McDonald's or KFC or, Renault, or, the Ford, they're all divesting and pulling out.
Is time on Putin's hands? He used time in Syria, he used time in Chechnya, he used time in Crimea. Is this on his side still? Especially, you mentioned that the West is still there, but somebody brought up the fact that there's a congressman introduced a piece of legislation called the Ukraine Fatigue Bill today or yesterday.
Right. Yeah, I think he would like to think it is, and the old saw is that Ukraine means a lot more to the Kremlin than to Washington because of geography, which is true. I don't see. I think Putin bet on that, and I think he bet wrong. I don't think that Putin is 70. He's in good shape, we believe, and I think he's got enough in him to invade a couple more countries. And I think he's got to be stopped. And I think that message has gone through Brussels, London, Washington. And I think if you look at the volume of aid coming in, it ain't going to happen.
And speaking of the aid coming in, what do you make of the slow walking of military support, that incremental? And now we're talking about weapons, but we're not talking about fighter jets. But the Ukrainians want the planes, and and the Abrams tank run on jet fuel, that they're going to arrive late. Can you walk us through a little bit of this rollout of Western military support?
Well, I think obviously the Ukrainians would love to see a whole bunch, more faster. I think there was always this fear of antagonizing Russia and kind of bringing it up gradually. Ukrainians, frankly, did a lot with not so much. As I said, Kyiv, Kharkiv, Kherson, they're holding off the Russians now. The stuff is getting in place, they have to be trained. The Abrams really are not that useful, as you mentioned. They're actually tanks that run on jet engines. They need a lot of training and special fuel. And we are sending in the Patriot anti-aircraft missiles. Ukrainians wanted the Israelis to sell them or provide them with Iron Dome, the anti-aircraft, anti-missile, anti-rocket. The Israelis didn't want to antagonize the Russians because they need them in Syria. They need a relationship in Syria. I think, watch the space. I think you're going to see a lot of progress and action in May. Victories, progress, they kind of define their own, that generates support. And one thing we really haven't talked about is the nuclear problem. And it's a serious, and that's what Putin came out with on Tuesday, basically nuclear threats. Nuclear is probably best used as a nuclear, it shouldn't be used, but if you want to get a bang for your buck, it's more effective as a threat because everyone understandably goes, ooh, scary. It is scary. Realistically, dropping a bomb on Ukraine, they don't have great troop concentrations, so militarily wouldn't have much effect. Where it could have an impact is taking out one of their dams in the Dnipro. There's a cascade of 6 dams, and that would cause massive flooding. The Ukrainians feel, we've already had our nuclear disaster thanks to Moscow, and that was called Chernobyl. And we lost probably thousands of people. There was thyroid cancers and pollution, and it doesn't make them inured, but it isn't spooking them. And if Putin drops a nuclear weapon, China and India and Brazil will all turn Russia into more of a pariah state. It'd be very hard for anyone to deal with someone who breaks the 75-year-old nuclear taboo. So I think that would that's keeping Putin back and staying in the area of threats. And if you read closely, he made his threat on Tuesday, and then today in Moscow, I think the under Deputy Minister of Defense said, well, actually, we're not going to be testing any weapons, we're not actually going to be adding more weapons, nothing is really changing. And I think the White House probably read that very closely, that sees that as a threat.
Right. You also talked about human rights and war crimes against humanity, and people made a big deal out of the vice president saying that there were crimes against humanity. And so it looks like the administration has been ramping up its rhetoric in this regard as well. So I was wondering if you could comment on that and also on the prospects for any kind of international legal Nuremberg type of, this is a long term.
Well, John, as you know, and everyone watching knows, Nuremberg happened after Germany was defeated. So nothing's going to happen until there's a regime change in Moscow. There are a dozen Russian soldiers in jail in Ukraine who are facing trials. And what they're doing now, and the vice president's statement was very important for putting out a marker and lending the prestige of her office to this. What is happening is there's a lot of fact collecting. Serious, skilled war crimes investigators have been to the northern suburbs of Kyiv where the atrocities take them. And that was more of the showcase. All these towns the Russians occupied, horrible things took place. I saw some figure of 65,000 war crimes. The bombing of the Mariupol theater, where maybe 400 or 500 people killed, and it was marked very clearly DT, which means children. So the investigators are building their cases, and that will happen if there is some sort of regime change in Moscow. Now, on that score, once again, and Putin, if he hangs on for 10 years, Russia will be isolated and impoverished. That's what they're buying into. So his successor will work hard over time to try to get in the good graces of the EU and the US. We saw with Slobodan Milosevic, the Serbian dictator, that he went up for trial after Serbia had basically regime change, or frankly, a democratic election, and he'd been voted out of power.
And I think there was some indication that the US didn't want to use those words so that Putin had a backdoor, had a way that, to get out. But I don't see the US offering this escape route for what's been going on there recently. The other question I had about, you talked about morale in Ukraine. What about their losses? We see this incredible devastation, and then at the same time, we see people out going, like you were saying, going to the cinema, and so there's some sense of normalcy, and also amid this very localized devastation, and also refugees who are coming back to Ukraine.
Yeah, I still get invitations on Facebook to the Kyiv Wednesday evening beer drink-a-thon. So people are trying to live a normal life, but it's not funny. And the guesstimate is that probably 100,000 Ukrainian soldiers have been killed or wounded, which is from a much smaller population, maybe 40 million. Russia's 144 million. Obviously, tens and thousands of the head of the UN, I think, said maybe 6,000 civilians have been killed. He said that's a gross underestimate. That's the ones they've been able to identify. They seem to have largely sort of buckled down and adjusted to this horrible new reality. I was in Israel, and some guy sort of sneered to me, well, I bet a lot of people aren't really supporting the war effort or left. And I said, sorry, but next time Israel's attacked, don't be surprised you see a lot of young men heading for the airport. That's how things happen, that not everybody buys into defending their country. And a little bit of non sequitur, but Zelensky, who happens to be Jewish, said this is our Israel moment, which is when we defend our country and emerge as an internationally recognized nation state. It's a nation building moment. I think he was referring to 1967 war. So the public opinion polls show that the Ukrainians are standing fast. The numbers vary, but because they are coming and going, but there may be as many as 5 million Ukrainians living in the EU. Surprise, surprise, they won't all come back. Ukrainians are very valued as workers throughout Europe. But I think that the patriotism is quite strong, and you'll see throughout Europe these Ukrainian rallies. You will not see really many Russian rallies. They're kind of keeping their heads down.
Or they're these choreographed rallies like we saw today, like as you mentioned, like the North Korea model.
Yeah, I'm saying rallies of Russian emigres in pro-war rallies. There's some sort of lost souls in Germany, but most of especially this new wave, the million Russians who left since February 24, they're very opposed to Putin, and a lot of them are working against Putin. And factoid, there are 3 Russian battalions of Russian soldiers fighting shoulder by shoulder with the Ukrainian army. And their game plan is we win, Putin loses. And similarly, there are two Belarusian battalions fighting alongside the Ukrainians, and their game plan is Ukraine wins, Lukashenko goes. Very simple.
And the other thing we've seen, and we've seen Putin's justification for war kind of change over the course of the year. And this week it was this is us against the West, and it's me against Biden. And you could see this split screen of Biden and Putin yesterday and today, each on public relations trying to get their messages out in the best way, with, foreign minister of China coming over, Biden going over to Poland. Are we falling into a trap that, what I haven't heard anybody say on this from the US side is, this is about Putin. It's not really about the Russian people. We don't have, we have great respect for the Russian people and their history and their culture, but I haven't seen that.
Yeah, I think the Russians are largely keeping their heads down and sort of trying not to get in trouble. I think the ones who leave will describe this as Putin's war, and they don't see it as Russia's war. And that's what Putin is doing is a pretty good selling point. It's us against the West. Everyone's being mean to us once again. And then, of course, he played the Nazi card, which never really worked because Zelensky's Jewish and his defense minister is Jewish. And, it has, he's a freely elected president. Putin, among the many reasons he hated Ukraine, is because Ukraine had multi-party competitive elections, was a democracy, had a very strong civil society, which has really stepped into the breach in the last year, a huge number of volunteers. So he feared that. He wanted Ukraine to be a little version of Russia, a little autocracy, kleptocracy, which Belarus is. And he just wanted to complete the trifecta. And the Ukrainians said no.
We've had a number of questions about what comes after Putin.
John, if I knew that, I'd be playing the stock market. I can't predict. I think there's some creepy guys who think they could be czar, and Putin had his own following, and he was popular and is popular. And so you can't, just because where the men's room is in the Kremlin, think that you can run the place, and it may well be another autocrat, but a milder version that's more palatable to the European Union, allowing sanctions to be dropped. I think there was a time, after Ivan the Terrible, called the Time of Troubles, Smuti, they call them, and the horrible Poles came in from the West and actually occupied the Kremlin. And if Putin goes and all things fall apart, there may be a time of a real struggle of disorganization. As I said, the Muslim areas of the South, the Chechens, the English, the Dagestanis may peel off on their own. There may be a whole bunch of new flags we're going to have to learn. The Volga Muslims may say, now's our time, Tatarstan, Bashkortostan. The Muslims, the three Buddhist republics, Buryatia, Kalmykia, and Tuva, may join Mongolia or Kazakhstan. I think, the edges may fray. And meanwhile, the only leading Democrat, Navalny, Putin is keeping him hostage in a Siberian jail. I will be lucky if the war is over and he's still alive. Putin's already tried to kill him once. So it's very, very hard to predict what's going to happen. But I don't think it's going to be good, and I don't think it's our fault. So.
Well, I would say this, Jim, you've done pretty well at predicting over the last year, and I've heard some predictions.
Well, maybe that's why I'm not predicting this one.
Is there any room for diplomacy?
Yeah, there is, and the Chinese will come up with a peace plan tomorrow, and let's see what it is. I just don't think Putin will accept going back to the February 24 lines, and the Ukrainians are on a bit of a roll. They've got essentially 1 million man and woman battle-hardened army, and they may just say, no, we're just going to wait until May, do our offensive, and knock out the Russian army and attack Crimea, which is, as I said, a can of worms.
You've addressed so many of them. We have a couple of factoid questions. Whatever happened to all the women and children who were kidnapped and taken out of Russia? Are they?
Well, I know, John, at one point I covered the Argentina and the desaparecidos, the children of the left-wingers who were kidnapped. And I think that story will play out over years. There will be kids coming forth saying, I was sent to Khabarovsk or somewhere. A couple of them have already come out. If you're under 14, it's pretty hard to move around. Historically, there have been a lot of Ukrainians living in the Russian Far East, but by now that was 3 or 4 generations ago. There will be tracking. I mean, these people don't have microchips, we don't really know who's who. But some of them are young. I mean, they're like 4-month-old babies. Who knows where that one went. Russia is going through a demographic contraction, so Putin needs more Slavic people to increase his gene pool and is not going to give them up to be nice. So it's a pretty diabolical situation we're looking at.
And one last question, another change from earlier talks, Jim. You had referred to Crimea. Crimea is difficult. You called it a can of worms tonight. But I'm getting the sense that you're thinking that Crimea may revert back or should revert back. And why do you call it a can of worms, somebody asked?
Crimea, of course, was run by Turkic people. It was actually a huge area for slave trading, and then grabbing Ukrainians and selling them to Turkey, the Ottoman Empire. Now it's then Catherine the Great came in around 1785, and then in 1954 Khrushchev gave it to Ukraine. Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic wasn't really a country. Was not a country. And then in 1991, actually, the Crimeans voted to go along with Ukraine in independence. The Russians love Crimea. They consider it theirs. The Turks love Crimea, but don't really consider it theirs. And the Ukrainians love Crimea and consider it theirs. I happen to be talking to you today from Florida. And if the Spanish came back and said, hey, that check in 1821 bounced and we want to take Florida back, some people might say, oh, well, it's part of the EU, whatever. The difference was that when the Russians took over Crimea, they stole everything. If you were Ukrainian, you lost your beach bar, your retirement house, your restaurant, your hotel, your resort. Everything was stolen. It wasn't just a change of sovereignty and oh, I'm Ukrainian, but I'll just go down and use my retirement house apartment. So there's a lot of bitterness in Ukraine saying, we want our stuff back. And there's a woman whose job, a minister of repatriation, and she said that any Russian that moved there since annexation will have to go. So we're basically, 2 different maps, 2 different versions of history, a big collision course. And it was probably the most exciting time for Putin when he took the place over. I mean, his approval ratings went through the roof, and Russians genuinely loved it, that they were back in the game again. And after so many defeats, they were expanding. So that's a toughie, but Ukraine, can it really live with Crimea controlled by Russia, which has veto power to the east over the Sea of Azov and to the west over the Black Sea and Odessa? There's been some talks that maybe Crimea could be turned into a neutral area like Danzig, but we know how some of us know how Danzig turned out. Neutral territories don't really often stay neutral. Crimea, just to get really far back, people have been fighting over Crimea since the year before Christ, since the Greeks, called Pontic Greeks, the Scythians. So it's been, people like Crimea. I've been there myself. It's not that great, but they love it.
Well, I think, Jim, you have once again shown us what it really, how it helps to have this kind of expertise at your fingertips, where you know the history and know the geography and can keep us informed. My sincere hope is we're not doing this a year from now, and that this is resolved, but I'm not sure about that. In any case, the fact that you've been here to help guide us through has been really a benefit for all of us who come on and listen to you. So thank you for sharing your expertise.
Great, John. Thank you. And thank you, Carol. And thank everyone for tuning in this evening. I appreciate it. Take care. Bye.
Bye-bye. Thanks a lot, Jim.
Bye.